Hello everyone, and welcome to my review for Spellforce, Conquest of Eo. I'm your host, Colors Fade. I know I'm late to this because the game has been out for nearly a year, but I finally had time to dive into this title, and considering the number of hours I've put into it already, it deserves a review. Spellforce, Conquest of Eo is the most inventive and unique fantasy 4X strategy game I've ever played. Developed by Owned by Gravity, a small indie studio comprised of about 10 employees, and published by THQ Nordic, Spellforce Conquest of Eo takes the 4X formula and turns it on its ear. It reworks some of the standard conventions of the genre into a completely new gaming experience. However, it's not without some small flaws. It has some balance and pacing issues that can make it feel frustrating or annoying to play at times. But overall, out of all the Fantasy 4X games I've played, this is the one I have enjoyed the most. Typically, these games are a little more than Civilization clones with a fantasy veneer. If you're familiar with the 4X genre, then you know how these games usually work. This is a time-lapse from the game Old World, and it perfectly illustrates how events unfold over the course of a single playthrough. You start with one city, or in the case of a Fantasy 4X, a wizard tower, then expand your empire by building more towns and outposts. All the factions do this, consuming the available real estate until all the unclaimed land is gone. Then war breaks out and everyone tries to conquer each other until a single winner arises, painting the map one color. The formula is fun and it works, but Spellforce Conquest of Eo tweaks it heavily to create a completely new and fresh experience. The first thing Spellforce Conquest of Eo does differently than other 4X games is remove the concept of conquering the map by acquiring land. This might sound odd for a game called Conquest of Eo, but it actually works wonderfully. Shortly after beginning the game, the player learns a spell that allows their wizard tower to levitate. This mobility becomes vital because in Conquest of Eo, most resources decay as they are mined. Thus, the player is forced to move frequently if they want to keep advancing their research and funding their armies. This forced movement is a huge departure from the typical 4X formula, and I admit it can feel very weird at first, but it doesn't take long to get used to this nomadic lifestyle. For one thing, it adds a new strategic layer to the game, rewarding players who can anticipate when they'll need to move and to where, and to plan their movements accordingly. For another thing, it makes scouts and apprentice mages incredibly important, not only for exploring the map, but to mine resources along the way. The second thing Conquest of Eo does differently is stick to a single map. Most 4X games come with a map generator, and part of the fun is navigating the unique geographic challenges of random maps. But Conquest of Eo takes place between Spellforce 1 and Spellforce 3, and it is part of a larger story within a defined world. Think of it like Middle-earth. It wouldn't make a lot of sense if it were a Lord of the Rings 4X game to rearrange the Shire, Rohan, and Mordor. We're all too familiar with how that land is supposed to be laid out, and the same is true for Eo. It's a defined world. You might think a single map would limit the replayability of the game, but in my experience, it doesn't affect it at all. For starters, the map is really big, and since the player doesn't win by acquiring land, every game plays out differently as you move your tower around the map, dealing with various quests, rival wizards, and landmarks. The map has several different regions and towns, and when the player first begins a new game, they can decide which region to start in, which will determine the difficulty of the initial enemies they'll face, as well as the kinds of resources they'll have access to. Towns are particularly important. In a lot of other 4X games, they act as little more than speed bumps on the player's path to geographic domination. But in Conquest of Eo, they are meant to be befriended. Each town offers several distinct services to the player in the form of resources, hirelings, and special items, like unique rooms for your tower that offer powerful bonuses, or unique units for your army. Thus, it becomes really important to befriend these cities as soon as possible and work the local quests in order to raise affinity with them. The more a city likes you, the better the rewards you'll gain. Another thing that makes Conquest of Eo different from other 4X games is that it leans heavily into quests. Most 4X games tend to focus on battles and land acquisition as a means of conquest, or racing research to unlock a powerful spell that wins the game. But in Conquest of Eo, the guiding forces are the story and the quests. In the story, you are an apprentice mage whose master has perished. You've been left with their wizard tower and must now try and piece together what happened. Along the way, you'll encounter the Circle of Mages, an elite group of rivals who see you as an upstart that needs to be put in your place. In order to win the game, you'll need to defeat 4 of them. At the start, players can define which 4 wizards they want to face or allow the game to select them randomly. I strongly suggest new players specify these wizards and choose the less hostile ones, such as Isgrim, Urea, Undergast, and Iana the Singer. Personally, I really like this game's focus on quests. Unlike a lot of other 4X games, there are no other victory conditions in Conquest of Eo. You either follow the story laid out in your spellbook and conquer the circle mages, or you perish. There's no amount of influence that will win you the game, and no magic ascension spell you can research. As a player who tends to focus on conquest in these sorts of games, I love the straightforward narrative at work here. To augment this main story, Conquest of Eo has tons of side quests scattered across the landscape. However, there's no dedicated quest journal, much to the chagrin of many players. But I found the game almost doesn't need one either. Opening the map reveals a list of all the quests that you have discovered so far, and clicking on any of them will center the screen on that quest location. Across the landscape, you can easily see the quest labeled, and when roaming bands of enemies are involved in a quest, the quest name displays above their stat. The only time the lack of a quest journal becomes problematic is when the player needs to bring a certain number of items back to a given location. That information is lacking from the brief title description, and it's up to the player to remember what they were sent to retrieve. But overall, I found this sort of stripped down quest list very easy to use and navigate. Conquest of Eo features a hexagonal turn-based combat system similar to other games of this genre. Anyone who has played Age of Wonders, for instance, or any other Fantasy 4X game really, will be very familiar with how combat plays out. There's nothing really groundbreaking here. It's a serviceable and familiar system, but I found myself using the auto-resolve option most of the time simply to speed things along. That said, there are some battles the player cannot auto-resolve, namely whenever attacking a wizard's home tower and the final endgame encounters. In those battles, the player must use the turn-based combat system, so it pays to do some of those battles and get used to how it works. It's also a good idea to engage the turn-based manual combat if you are at risk of losing a unit using the auto-resolve option. The game will warn you if it thinks this is going to happen. I tend to play out the battles in manual mode more often in the early part of the game, before I have a strong enough stat to win battles with auto-resolve. Speaking of stacks, this is where, at least in my opinion, the first cracks in the game's balance start to show. When the game begins, the player can field 4 units in a single stack. An apprentice mage or hero can allow for 5 units. This number can then be increased over time as the player's tower levels up in power, or by befriending a specific town on the map that will provide a tower room blueprint that increases stack size by 1. It might not seem like a big deal, but even 1 extra unit matters a lot in this game, and it doesn't take long to realize that in Conquest of Eo, size matters. Unfortunately, there are 2 balance issues that I found somewhat irksome as I played through several scenarios. Now, before I dig into this, I want to state that everything I'm about to discuss here refers to the game's default balanced difficulty mode. There are other options, and we'll talk about those later. The first problem I have with stack sizes is that as the player's stack size grows, the game automatically inflates enemy stack sizes to compensate. Now, this makes sense to me with regards to the other wizards of the circle, but not for the random monsters that frequent the landscape. Player stack size is tied to the level of their tower and any additional rooms that they have installed that give stack size bonuses. But monsters have no such relationship with a wizard tower. They don't belong to a tower and they have no master. So how does their size get bigger other than just artificial inflation? It doesn't make any sense. No matter what the player does, short of playing a necromancer, the AI-controlled monsters almost always end up with more units in them than the player does. But it isn't just stack size that's the issue. The second problem is the number of enemies that the game constantly throws at the player. Enemies attack seemingly non-stop, at least in the first half of the game. Wave after wave coming after the player's wizard tower, the apprentice lodges, and the all-fire nodes. And since resources are scarce and they decay over time, forcing the player to frequently move their tower and apprentice lodges, it can be a challenge to field more than 1 combat-ready stack to deal with all of it, at least until the endgame. The bottom line is that because the player can only reliably field 1 strong, combat-ready stack, at least for the first 2/3 of the game, the majority of the time in Conquest of Eo feels like a Fantasy 4X version of Whack-A-Mole. Teleportation and tower recall spells make this easier in the mid to late game, but until then it can feel tiresome to deal with all the enemy units as they race towards the player and outpace the player's power. As it stands, the only time this game of whack-a-mole becomes really fun is at the very end game, when most of the opposing wizards have been defeated and the player finally has enough resources to fund multiple stacks of power. In my opinion, the game would have been better served by having a wider array of enemy stack sizes throughout. There's no reason that lesser monsters who aren't part of a wizard tower need to grow from a stack size of 2 and 3 to stack sizes of 7 and 8 just to keep pace with the player's maximum stack capability. Smaller enemy stacks are still a threat to block all fire nodes or loot an unattended wizard tower or destroy apprentice lodges. But here's the thing. If there were still small stacks of enemies on the map, then the player's other less capable stacks could actually deal with them, which would leave the player's main stack free to handle the more critical threats and main quests. It would make all the player's apprentice stacks viable instead of just the one powerful stack. And in my opinion, that would be a lot more fun. I mentioned earlier that there are wizard apprentices in the game and that the player can recruit them. Unfortunately, because of the way the game is tuned balance-wise, these units don't really live up to their potential, at least until the endgame. To understand why, I first need to discuss the way the game handles victory conditions. Most 4X games like this have a variety of different victory conditions, from research to alliance to ascension and conquest. I'm typically a conquest player, so I really appreciate how Conquest of Eo handles this. They do away with all the other victory conditions and focus entirely on the conquest aspect. The main story of this game is about you trying to ascend into the ranks of the Circle of Mages, and to do that, you need to defeat them. In order to join the Circle of Mages, the player first needs to complete a minimum of 3 of 6 tasks they're assigned. One of those tasks is to recruit up to 5 apprentice mages. The problem here is that the way the game is tuned, it's very difficult to field any kind of substantial power with these mages in their stacks. Since it behooves the player to have one all-powerful stack to deal with the biggest threat, this leaves the apprentice mages with leftover units of lesser power. And since the power dynamic in the game automatically adjusts itself towards the player's strongest stack and biggest stack size, that makes all these other apprentice stacks little more than cannon fodder. Again, mostly for the first 2/3 of the game. Things change when you get to the end. The benefit of having multiple apprentices is they can build mage lodges, which can collect nearby resources. But the game loves throwing enemies at those lodges to destroy them, or worse, convert them to another wizard. And unfortunately, the player's apprentice mage stacks just can't defend them very well. So it falls on the player's main stack to do the work of defending them by spending precious turns traveling to them, or later mana to teleport to them. If it were easier for the player to field more powerful stacks for each of their apprentices in their employment, it would make sense to recruit them. But since it's not easy, most of your time will be spent babysitting these apprentice mages and trying to keep them from dying, and that's just not nearly as fun as it could be. In addition to the wizard apprentices you can recruit, the game also features heroes. These are very powerful units that can wear equipment, further boosting their capability. The player can have only one hero though, and each has their own unique story. I stumbled across a powerful troll warlord hero that was constantly attracting the attention of other troll armies. Some of these freely joined my cause as controllable units, while others simply wandered around, following my tower every time I moved it. It was kind of awesome having these groupies because while they were not under my direct control, they did a pretty good job at defending armies from my tower. I'm looking forward to trying out each of the heroes and going through their stories because they all seem pretty different. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the wizard archetypes you can play, because I think this is another area where Conquest of Eo sets itself apart. There are 4 default archetypes and they all have very distinct playstyles. There's also an option to customize your own wizard, but oddly enough you can't choose a custom portrait. It's not a big deal since the portrait only shows up in the save files, but still, I found it strange that the game lacked such an obvious feature. And I found it stranger still that you couldn't choose some sort of race for your wizard with distinctive racial bonuses. Customizing a wizard involves selecting a method of crafting as well as 2 books of magic, and the player will definitely find other books of magic as the game progresses. But unlike other Fantasy 4X games, it's not really the books of magic that make your wizard distinct, it's the method of crafting. There are 4 options to choose from: the alchemist, the necromancer, the artificer, and the demonologist. Alchemists craft and employ potions to empower their stacks, while artificers craft powerful glyphs that they can affix to individual units. I've spent the bulk of my time playing the Artificer wizard, and it's an absolute blast. There's a spell that will allow you to remove the glyphs from units and reuse them, so affixing them to a unit isn't permanent. Thus, you don't have to worry about pre-planning your glyph usage or making mistakes or wanting a do-over when you discover better glyphs. And then there's Necromancy. Necromancers gain their advantage on the battlefield by having access to 2 tower rooms that increase stack size. So while they don't ever craft their own potions or glyphs, they can have the biggest armies in the game. And keep in mind, you can still buy potions and glyphs from the cities, so it's not like you're locked out of those tools if you don't play those archetypes. But obviously, playing an alchemist or an artificer allows you to craft what you want when you need it and not rely on the random vendor stocks in the various city stores. Finally, there's the demonologist, which has access to demons that possess other units and grow stronger over time. If the unit dies, the demon returns to the wizard stronger than before and ready to possess another soul. It's a really unique wizard archetype I haven't really seen in other Fantasy 4X games, and I'm eager to spend more time with. I said earlier that the game's default balanced difficulty mode actually feels a bit unbalanced to me, with enemy stack sizes outpacing the player as the game wears on. But it's not just the power dynamic that feels a bit off, it's the pacing as well. The default game pace feels entirely too fast. It feels like the player needs to sprint to the absolute most powerful spells and unit types as fast as possible, ignoring everything else, including all quests and side tasks, in order to focus entirely on building a single combat-ready stack. If you don't do this, you'll die. Fortunately, the game comes with several difficulty sliders. It's possible to adjust the frequency of tower attacks, for instance, as well as the overall aggressiveness of the enemies, and even the overall strength of the enemy stack sizes. Most importantly, though, the game allows you to adjust world progression setting. If I had one piece of advice for new players, it would be to lower this setting down a notch and use the time to explore setting. To me, this felt like it should be the default pace for the game. I love that it was immediately apparent that this was a fantasy setting. Landmarks, monsters, and even lighting effects scream fantasy loud and clear. Compare that with the Master of Magic remake that came out around the same time as Conquest of Eo, and you can see a clear difference in design philosophies. Master of Magic barely looks like a fantasy world at all, instead appearing more like a regular Civilization game. That actually was one of the reasons I couldn't get into it. It just didn't look like a fantasy world. But Conquest of Eo doesn't have that problem. It looks, feels, and sounds like a proper Fantasy 4X world. The developers even use different lighting effects when the player pans to more sinister regions like those populated by undead or demons. Overall, it's a very satisfying experience from a visual and audio standpoint, and it performs wonderfully as well. Granted, I have a high-end machine, but never once did I run into any performance issues or crashes. In fact, I only ran into one bug during the 80+ hours I've been playing it. It's an incredibly polished title. Because Conquest of Eo does so many things differently from a standard Fantasy 4X title, it took me a little time to acclimate to it. But once I did, it quickly became my favorite Fantasy 4X game. I've been looking for something like this since I stopped playing Master of Magic back in the late 90s. And the balance and pacing issues I mentioned can easily be dealt with by adjusting the difficulty sliders, so it's not really a complaint against the game per se. I just prefer beating games on their default normal settings, and so far I've been unable to do that with Conquest of Eo. I keep having to adjust the world progression setting and turn it down to time to explore in order to have enough time to enjoy the game and win. Still, this is a really fun game to play, and maybe the best thing I can say about it is that it has that just one more turn magic that all great 4X games seem to have. Bottom line, Spellforce Conquest of Eo is now my favorite Fantasy 4X game. I still like Age of Wonders 4 quite a bit, but Spellforce's unique take on tower movement, wizard crafting archetypes, resource gathering, and its focus on storytelling and quests really elevated above the fray. I'm honestly surprised I haven't heard more about this game, because in a packed field of contenders, it's the best of the bunch in my opinion. I'm Colors Fade, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Leave questions and comments down below. If you played the game, let me know and tell me what you think, and I'll see you next time. Until then, happy gaming everyone.